The year was 1887, and the wind in the high country of the territories was a living thing. It had a voice, a personality, and a particular malice for the cabin of Elias Vance. It scoured the log walls, searching for purchase in the chinking, and moaned under the eaves like a creature in mourning. To Elias, the sound was just another layer of the silence that had become his only real companion. His isolation was a fortress he had built with his own two hands, log by painful log, high on a ridge that overlooked the distant, hazy smudge of the town of Redemption. He had chosen the spot for its difficulty, for the way it discouraged visitors. The world had looked upon his face and recoiled, and so he had given the world his back. The left side of his face was a ruin, a geography of pain mapped out in puckered, discolored flesh. A long-ago fire had claimed his cheek, his ear, and the corner of his eye, pulling the skin taut in a permanent, grotesque snarl. The man he had been before the fire was a ghost, a memory so distant it felt like a story told about someone else. Now he was only the scarred man, a hermit, a creature of rumor and cautionary tales for the children in the town below. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his body thick with the muscle of a life lived by axe and saw. He hunted, he trapped, he tended his small garden, and he spoke to no one. The silence was his penance, and the solitude his shield. Inside the cabin, the world was small and ordered. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, a single chair. Everything had its place, a testament to a mind that craved control over the small things when the large things had been so irrevocably lost. He traced the rim of his tin cup, the metal cool against his calloused thumb. Outside, the sky was bruising, turning the color of an old plum as a late autumn storm gathered its strength. He had enough wood, enough salted meat. He was prepared. He was always prepared for the predictable hardships of the wild. It was the unpredictable cruelty of people he had retreated from. The mirror he had shattered years ago still reflected in the eyes of every stranger, a shard of glass that reminded him of what he was, a monster. He believed it because the world had told him it was so, and he had long ago stopped arguing. Miles away, on the rutted track that passed for a road to redemption, Clara Hale was learning the true meaning of darkness. It was not merely the absence of light, it was an entity, a heavy blanket that smothered the world she once knew. Her blindness had come on slowly at first, a blurring at the edges of things, a betrayal by her own body. Then, a fever had swept through her 9 months ago, and when it broke, it had taken the last of her sight with it, leaving her in this permanent, terrifying midnight. Her world, once vibrant with the color of wildflowers and the expanse of the prairie sky, was now a tapestry woven from sound, scent, and touch. She sat on the hard seat of the wagon, her hands clenched in the lap of her worn wool dress. Her brother-in-law, a man whose charity had grown thin and brittle, had finally decided she was a burden he could no longer carry. He was taking her to redemption, to an estranged aunt she hadn't seen since she was a girl, a woman who had not even known of her affliction when she'd agreed to take her in. Clara felt less like a niece going to visit family and more like a parcel being delivered, postage due. The sharp scent of pine on the wind and the growing chill told her the storm Elias Vance was watching was also coming for them. Almost there, her brother-in-law, Walter, said, his voice tight with impatience. He spoke to her now, as if she were simple-minded, not just blind. The condescension was a small, constant abrasion against her spirit. She did not reply, only lifted her face to the wind. It carried the scent of rain and cold stone. The familiar world was gone, and this new one was full of sharp edges and sudden drops. Her stasis was not one of quiet solitude, but of frightening dependency. She was adrift, her life in the hands of others who saw her as broken. She clutched the small, smooth stone in her pocket, a memento from a time when she could see the river it came from, and prayed for a strength she did not feel. The first crack of thunder was a physical blow, a violent tremor in the air that made the horses shy and dance in their harnesses. Walter cursed, his voice a whip-crack of anger. The wagon lurched. Clara heard a sharp, splintering sound, followed by a violent jolt that threw her from her seat. She landed hard on the unforgiving ground, the air knocked from her lungs in a painful gasp. The world erupted into a cacophony of panicked noise. Walter shouting, the horses whinnying in terror, the rumble of the wagon breaking free and crashing down the embankment. Then, there was only the sound of the rising wind and the approaching rain. "Walter," she called out, her voice thin and reedy. Silence. A profound, terrifying silence where a man's voice should have been. She pushed herself up, her hands sinking into the cold, damp earth. Mud stained her dress, and a sharp pain flared in her ankle. "Walter!" she cried again, louder this time, a thread of panic weaving through her voice. The only answer was the groan of the wind through the pines and the first, fat drops of rain that began to fall like icy tears on her upturned face. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, at the mercy of a coming storm in a world she could not see. The darkness inside her head had merged with the darkness of the wilderness, and for the first time she understood that her life depended on a stranger's kindness or her own impossible resilience. Elias was securing the shutters when he heard it, a faint cry carried on the wind, almost indistinguishable from the shrieking of the storm. He paused, his hand frozen on the wooden latch, and listened. He was accustomed to the tricks of the wind, the way it could mimic voices and screams. But this was different. It had the timbre of human desperation. He told himself it was nothing. He had no business with the world, and the world had no business with him. He was shutting it out, just as he always did. He finished with the shutter and turned back toward the warmth of his fire. But the sound came again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, calling a name. It was closer than he thought. Cursing under his breath, Elias grabbed his heavy oilskin coat and his rifle. He did not want to do this. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside, to let the world handle its own problems. But the ghost of the man he used to be, the man who had run into a burning building to save a child, stirred within him. That man had died in the fire, but his ashes still lingered. He stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at him, and the rain, now a torrential downpour, was cold enough to steal his breath. He followed the sound, his boots sinking into the mud, his scarred face turned into the biting onslaught. He found the wreckage first, a splintered wagon wheel, a broken axle, the dark shapes of two dead horses tangled in their harnesses. There was no sign of a driver. Then he saw her, a lone figure, huddled at the base of a great pine, her dress soaked and muddy, her shoulders shaking. He approached slowly, his steps heavy and deliberate. He didn't want to startle her. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. Clara flinched violently at the sound. It was deep, gravelly, and closer than she'd expected. She scrambled backward, her injured ankle protesting with a sharp stab of pain. "Who's there?" she asked, her own voice trembling. "Name's Elias," he said, keeping his distance. "I live up on the ridge. I saw your wagon." He scanned the area again. "Are you alone?" "My brother-in-law, Walter, he was here," she stammered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I think he ran, or he was thrown. I don't know." Her head was turned slightly to his left, her eyes open but unseeing, fixed on a point somewhere beyond his shoulder. It took him a moment to understand. She wasn't looking past him. She couldn't see him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. She couldn't see the ruin of his face. "You're hurt," he stated, his gaze falling to her ankle, which was already beginning to swell. "And this storm's only getting started. You can't stay out here. My cabin is close. It's warm. Trust a stranger, a man with a voice like rocks grinding together, who lived alone on a mountain." Every instinct screamed no, but the alternative was freezing to death. The cold was already deep in her bones. "I can't walk very well," she said, her teeth chattering. He hesitated for only a second. "I can help you." Elias closed the distance between them. He stopped in front of her, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. For the first time in a decade, he stood before another person without feeling the immediate, burning shame of their gaze. He was just a man offering shelter. It was a novel, unnerving feeling. He gently took her arm. She flinched at his touch but didn't pull away. Her skin was like ice. "All right," she whispered, the single word a surrender to necessity. He bent down, carefully scooping her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a bird. As he lifted her, her head rested against his chest, and she was so close she could have seen every scar, every twisted line of his face. But her eyes remained vacant, staring into the rain. He held his breath, a strange mix of relief and an emotion he couldn't name washing over him, and turned toward home, carrying the world he had forsaken back into his fortress. The journey back to the cabin was a battle against the elements. Elias shielded Clara's body with his own, his broad back taking the brunt of the wind and rain. She remained silent in his arms, a tense bundle of cold and fear. He could feel the fine tremor that ran through her, a vibration of shock and exhaustion. He moved with an unthinking certainty over the treacherous ground, his knowledge of the terrain as intimate as the knowledge of his own scars. For Clara, the experience was a dizzying chaos of sensation. The rough texture of his oilskin coat against her cheek, the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beating against her ear, the scent of wet earth, pine and wood smoke that clung to him. His grip was firm but not harsh, a solid anchor in the swirling tempest. He pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. The sudden warmth was a shock to her system, a wave of comfort so profound it almost made her weep. He gently set her down in the single wooden chair by the hearth, where the fire crackled and spat, casting a dancing orange light that she could feel as a gentle heat on her skin. "I'll get you a blanket," he said, his voice softer in the enclosed space. She heard his heavy footsteps move away, the sound of a wooden chest opening, and then his return. He draped a thick, coarse wool blanket around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedar and disuse. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the howling of the storm outside and the crackling of the fire within. It was a silence starkly different from the one Elias normally inhabited. His was a solitude of emptiness. This was a silence filled with the presence of another human being, fraught with uncertainty and observation. He stood by the hearth watching her, acutely aware of her stillness. He was a man used to being stared at, but her unseeing gaze was something else entirely. It was unnerving in its own way, an appraisal conducted by senses he couldn't fool. Clara listened. She catalogued the sounds of the room, building a map in her mind. The steady drip of water from his coat onto the floorboards, the low sigh of the logs settling in the fire, the almost inaudible rustle of his clothes as he shifted his weight. He was a large man. She had felt it in the breadth of his chest and the strength of his arms. But he was quiet, his movements measured, not clumsy. She had expected a beast, a lumbering giant, but this man moved with a strange, contained grace. "Your ankle," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "I should look at it." She tensed. "It's fine." "No, it's not." He countered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's swelling. If it's broken, it'll need setting." He moved toward her, and she heard him kneel on the floorboards. The sound was close, intimate. She instinctively pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady. "I just need to see." She nodded, a small, jerky motion. He gently lifted the hem of her wet dress, his touch surprisingly careful. His fingers, calloused and rough, probed the area around her ankle with a practiced gentleness she did not expect. She winced when he found the most tender spot. "It's not broken," he announced after a moment. "Badly sprained, though. I'll wrap it." He rose and moved to a cupboard. She heard the clink of a bottle, the tearing of clean cloth. He returned and knelt before her again. The scent of liniment, sharp and medicinal, filled the air. As he worked, binding her ankle with firm, efficient movements, his proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the soft sound of his breathing. She was acutely aware of his nearness, of the fact that this complete stranger was tending to her with a focused care she hadn't received from her own family. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I told you, Elias." "No, your full name." He paused in his work for a beat. "Elias Vance." "I am Clara Hale," she offered. "Thank you, Mr. Vance, for all of this." "Just Elias," he grunted, finishing the wrapping and securing the cloth with a knot. He remained kneeling before her for a second longer than necessary. In the flickering firelight, he studied her face. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 20 or 21. Her face was pale and fine-boned, framed by damp, dark hair that had come loose from its pins. There was a smudge of mud on her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and gently brushed it away with his thumb. Clara went rigid at the unexpected touch on her face. It wasn't a clinical touch, like when he'd examined her ankle. It was something else, personal. She didn't flinch away, but her breath caught in her throat. She felt the roughness of his skin against hers, a fleeting, strangely gentle contact. Elias snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, horrified by his own impulse. He stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "You're hungry," he said, his voice gruff again, a wall thrown back up. "I've got stew." He turned his back to her and busied himself at the hearth, ladling a thick, savory-smelling stew into a wooden bowl. His heart was pounding. What had he been thinking, touching her like that? It was the kind of casual gesture that belonged to a world he was no longer part of, a world of gentle touches and unthinking affection. He was a monster, and he had forgotten his place. The storm raged for 2 days, imprisoning them in the small cabin. Time, stretched and blurred, measured only by the cycles of stoking the fire, the meager meals they shared, and the shifting light that Clara could only perceive as a change in the warmth on her skin. The initial tension between them slowly began to fray at the edges, worn down by forced proximity and the quiet rhythms of cohabitation. Elias discovered that Clara was not the fragile invalid her circumstances suggested. Though her movements were cautious, she insisted on helping where she could. She sat at his table and methodically polished his few pieces of silverware until they gleamed, her sensitive fingers finding every speck of tarnish. She learned the layout of the cabin 3 steps from the chair to the table, 7 to the hearth, navigating the small space with a growing confidence that impressed him. Her presence filled his home with small domestic sounds he hadn't realized he'd missed. The soft swish of her dress, the quiet hum of a tune she murmured to herself, the light clink of a spoon against a bowl. Clara, in turn, learned Elias through his silence. She learned the sound of his breathing when he was thoughtful, a slow, deep rhythm. She learned the heavy, weary sigh he gave at the end of the day as he sank into his cot on the far side of the room. She learned the scrape of his razor in the morning, a private, methodical ritual. He was a man of routine, of deep-seated habits born from years of solitude. He rarely spoke unless necessary, but when he did, his words were direct and unadorned. Yet, she began to hear things in his voice that were not on the surface, a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion, a carefully guarded gentleness. On the second afternoon, she sat by the fire, her hands resting in her lap. "Elias," she began, her voice soft. He was sharpening a skinning knife by the cabin's single window, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a constant, soothing sound. "Yes? What does the storm look like?" He stopped his work. It was a strange question. He had never been asked to put the world into words before. He looked out the window, really looked, trying to see it as something other than an inconvenience. "It's white," he started, his voice rough with the effort. "The snow is coming down so thick you can't see the trees at the edge of the clearing. The wind is piling it up against the cabin wall. It's like the whole world has been erased." She smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. "I remember snow. I remember how it could make everything silent. An impulse, as reckless as the one that had made him touch her cheek, seized him. "It's not silent," he said, his voice dropping lower. "The wind, it howls around the corners of the roof, like a thing grieving, and the snow isn't just white. Where the light from the window hits it, it's almost blue." He stopped, embarrassed by his own uncharacteristic poetry. Clara turned her face toward the sound of his voice, her expression rapt. "Blue," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Thank you. I can almost see it." That small exchange was a key turning in a long rusted lock. Later that evening, as he banked the fire for the night, she spoke again from her chair. "How did it happen?" she asked quietly. He knew instantly what she meant. He froze, his back to her, a log held tight in his hand. The old shame, the familiar feeling of being a sideshow attraction, washed over him. But her tone held no morbid curiosity. It was simple, direct, an honest question. She could not see him, he reminded himself. She was only asking about the story, not the spectacle. He placed the log on the fire, watching the embers flare up around it. "A fire," he said, his voice flat. "In a boarding house, back east, years ago. I was trying to get a little girl out of an upstairs room." "Did you?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Yes," he said. The word was heavy with the memory of smoke and screaming, of heat that melted flesh from bone. "She got out all right." He did not say that the girl's mother had screamed when she saw his face afterward. He did not say that the town he had saved had thanked him with averted eyes and fearful whispers. He did not need to. Clara heard the vast, empty spaces between his words. She heard the cost. "You were brave," she said softly. He turned from the fire to look at her. In the dim light, her face was serene. No pity, no revulsion, just a simple statement of fact. For the first time in more than a decade, someone had looked past the monster and seen the man, and she had done it without even having to see him. A crack appeared in the thick wall around his heart, small but profound, letting in a sliver of light he had long forgotten existed. He said nothing, only gave a stiff, jerky nod that she could not see, and retreated to the shadows of his side of the room. But that night, the silence in the cabin felt less like emptiness and more like peace. On the third morning, the world was reborn in stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of impossible beauty and silence. When Elias opened the door, the sunlight that streamed in was dazzling, reflecting off a pristine blanket of deep snow. "It's over," he announced. The air was frigid but clean, scrubbed of all its fury. Clara stood, using the back of her chair for support. Her ankle was still tender, but the swelling had gone down. "My aunt, she'll be worried sick," she said, though a part of her felt a strange reluctance to leave the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. "The town, is it far?" "Half a day's walk in this," he said, gesturing to the snow. "Longer for you, with your ankle. I'll take you." The journey to redemption was slow and arduous. Elias walked ahead, clearing a path through the deep drifts, frequently turning to offer Clara his hand over difficult patches. She came to rely on the solid, dependable presence of his hand in hers, the warmth of his grip seeping through her glove. He described the world to her as they went. "The snow is clinging to all the pine branches," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier gruffness. "It makes them hang low, like they're bowing. And the sun is so bright on the snow it hurts to look at." He paused. "There's a cardinal in a birch tree, a flash of red against all the white. It's beautiful." Clara smiled, holding his arm as they navigated a slippery patch of ice. "You have a poet's soul, Elias Vance." He grunted, a sound of dismissal, but he could feel a warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with the exertion. He was seeing the world anew, through the filter of her blindness. He was noticing details he had long since stopped paying attention to, finding beauty in a world he had only ever seen as harsh. They reached the outskirts of redemption as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of pink and gold. The town was a collection of stern-faced buildings, smoke curling from every chimney. As they walked down the main street, people stopped and stared. They saw the town oddity, the monstrous hermit from the mountain, walking with a strange woman leaning on his arm. Whispers followed them like the rustling of dry leaves. Elias felt the old shame rise in his throat, hot and familiar. He instinctively pulled his hat down lower, trying to hide his face. Suddenly, a man stepped out of the mercantile, blocking their path. He was well dressed in a fine wool coat, his face clean-shaven and florid with indignation. "Clara, my God, we thought you were dead." Clara recognized the voice instantly. "Mr. Prescott." Arthur Prescott's eyes swept over her disheveled appearance and then landed on Elias. His handsome face twisted into a mask of disgust and suspicion. "What is the meaning of this? What has this creature done to you?" Elias froze, his hand tightening on Clara's arm. The word creature struck him like a physical blow. It was the world's voice, loud and clear. "Mr. Prescott, this is Mr. Vance," Clara said, her voice firm and clear, projecting a strength that surprised Elias. "He saved my life. My wagon crashed in the storm, and he gave me shelter." Prescott ignored her explanation, his eyes still fixed on Elias's scarred face. "He brought you to his lair, unchaperoned. The man is a menace. Everyone knows it. Clara, you must come with me at once. Your aunt is beside herself." He reached for her other arm, intending to pull her away. Clara took a step back, pulling her arm from Prescott's grasp and moving closer to Elias's side. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but to Elias it was everything. She was choosing to stand with him. "I am fine, Arthur," she said, her tone cold. "Mr. Vance has been nothing but a gentleman. He is escorting me to my aunt's house now." Prescott scoffed, his gaze dripping with contempt. "A gentleman? Look at him, Clara. If only you could see. The man is a monster. He has clearly taken advantage of your condition." He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper meant to be overheard. "His face is a horror. He probably kept you prisoner." The words were meant to poison her, to turn her against the man who had saved her. But Clara had listened to Elias's breathing in the dark. She had heard him describe a red bird against the snow. She knew the man's character in a way Arthur Prescott, with his perfect sight, never could. "His face," she said, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce clarity that made Prescott take a step back, "is of no concern to me. I have been shown more kindness and honor by this monster in 2 days than I have been shown by this town in my entire life. Now, if you will excuse us, we are leaving." She turned, took Elias's arm and said softly, for his ears only, "Take me to my aunt's house, please." Stunned into silence, Elias led her away, leaving Arthur Prescott standing speechless in the middle of the street. For the first time, the whispers and stares of the townspeople seemed to lose their power. They were not aimed at him alone anymore. They were aimed at them, and in that shared condemnation he found a strange and unexpected strength. Clara's defense of him was a shield, more effective than any wall of solitude he had ever built. The confrontation with Prescott left a bitter taste in the air. Elias walked Clara to a small, neat house at the edge of town, the silence between them heavy with unspoken things. A woman, thin and anxious, rushed out the door her aunt. The reunion was a flurry of tearful words and worried questions. Elias stood back, an awkward, hulking figure on the periphery. Clara's aunt, Martha, finally turned to him, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension as she took in his scarred face. We are in your debt, Mr. Vance," she stammered, clutching Clara's hand as if he might snatch her back. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." "There's no debt," Elias said, his voice flat. He looked at Clara, a profound sense of loss already settling in his chest. He had returned her to her world. His time as her protector was over. He was to retreat back to his silence, to his fortress on the mountain, but the silence seemed more menacing now, more empty. He had grown accustomed to the sound of her humming. "Thank you, Elias," Clara said softly, turning her face toward him. He simply nodded, unable to find the right words. He turned without another glance and walked away, the crunch of his boots on the snow, the sound of his loneliness returning. The following days were a torment for both of them. Clara found her aunt's house suffocating. Martha, though well-meaning, treated her like a fragile piece of porcelain. She was constantly guided, warned, and fussed over. The town, fueled by Prescott's malicious gossip, saw her as a fallen woman, tainted by her association with the mountain hermit. She was pitied and judged in equal measure. She missed the quiet competence of Elias's cabin. She missed his low voice describing the world. She missed the feeling of safety she'd felt in the presence of the man everyone else called a monster. For Elias, the cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage filled with the ghost of her presence. He saw her imprint everywhere, the impossibly shiny spoon she had polished, the slight depression in the chair by the fire, the lingering faint scent of lavender that had clung to her hair. The silence was deafening. It mocked him. He tried to fall back into his old routines, but they felt hollow. He had described a sunset for her, and now he couldn't look at one without thinking of her rapt, sightless face. One evening, Arthur Prescott came to call at Martha's house. He brought flowers and a proposition, his voice oozing a proprietary sympathy. He offered to marry Clara. It would be the Christian thing to do, he said, loud enough for Clara to hear from the next room. To give you my name, to protect you. No one else will have you now, not after your time with him. I can give you a respectable life. Clara felt a cold fury rise within her. He wasn't offering love or even companionship. He was offering a cage, a life as a charity case, a way to redeem his own image by playing the saint. He wanted to own her, to possess the poor, blind girl and display her as a testament to his own magnanimity. She walked into the parlor, her steps firm, her head held high. "I thank you for your offer, Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice steady, "but I must decline." Prescott and her aunt stared at her in disbelief. "Clara, be reasonable," Martha pleaded. "He is offering you a future." "He is offering me a prison," Clara countered. "I will not be a project. I will not be your act of charity." She turned her face toward Prescott. "I would rather live alone in darkness for the rest of my days than be your wife." The next morning, before the sun was fully up, Clara packed a small bag. She left a note for her aunt, a simple apology and an explanation that she could not stay where she was not seen for who she was. Then, with a sturdy branch for a walking stick, she slipped out of the house. She knew the general direction of the mountain. She knew the feel of the rising sun on her right cheek. And she began to walk, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating resolve. She was walking toward the one place she had not felt broken. She was walking home. It was nearly dusk when Elias saw the figure, a small, dark shape moving slowly, resolutely up the path toward his cabin. He grabbed his rifle, his first instinct one of defense, before he recognized the determined set of her shoulders, the familiar way she held her head. It was Clara. He ran from the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs, covering the snowy ground in great strides. "Clara, what are you doing?" he cried out as he reached her. She was exhausted, her face flushed with cold and exertion, but she was smiling. "I came back," she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "But your aunt, the town," he stammered, completely bewildered. "The town is not my home," she said, her voice firm. "And my aunt means well, but she sees a burden. Prescott sees a charity case. You are the only one who has seen me." He stood before her, speechless. The entire world had thrown her away, and she had walked back to him, the scarred recluse, the monster on the mountain. He felt a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to buckle his knees. Gratitude, disbelief, and a fierce, terrifying tenderness. She was choosing this, choosing him. He saw movement further down the path. Prescott, on horseback, followed by two other men from town. They had come for her. "Clara," Prescott yelled, his face a thundercloud of rage. "Get away from him. You've lost your mind." Elias stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. "She is here because she chooses to be," he said, his voice a low growl. "You have no claim on her." "She is a helpless blind woman," Prescott spat, dismounting. "She doesn't know what she's doing. This beast has bewitched her. I'm taking her back for her own good." He started forward, but Clara's voice stopped him cold. "No," she said, stepping out from behind Elias to stand beside him. She reached out and found Elias's hand, her fingers lacing with his. Her touch was an anchor, a declaration. "My blindness does not make me helpless, Arthur. It has, in fact, allowed me to see things more clearly than you ever will. I see a man who is cruel and vain, who uses pity as a weapon. And I see a man," she said, turning her face up toward Elias, "who is brave and kind and honorable, a man who showed me a cardinal in a snow-covered tree." Tears pricked at Elias's eyes, blurring the sight of the men before him. Her words were a balm on wounds he thought were permanent. He looked down at her fierce, beautiful, trusting face. He saw his future, he saw his home, and in that moment he understood what he had to do, what he had to offer. He slowly let go of her hand and knelt in the snow before her, in full view of the men from the town. He took her hand again, pressing it to his lips. He looked up at her, his scarred face exposed and vulnerable, his heart laid bare. "Clara Hale," he said, his voice thick with emotion but clear for all to hear. "I have nothing to offer you but a simple cabin and a quiet life. I am not a handsome man. The world looks at me and sees a monster." He paused, his gaze unwavering on her sightless eyes. "But I can be your eyes. I can describe every sunrise and every wildflower. I can keep you safe and guard your steps. I can be your eyes and your protector, if you will be my beauty." Clara's breath hitched. A single tear traced a path down her cold cheek. The world had defined beauty for her by sight, by mirrors, and the admiring glances of others. Elias was redefining it as acceptance, as seeing the soul. He was not asking her to ignore his scars. He was asking her to be the beauty that made them irrelevant. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with tears of her own. She squeezed his hand. "Oh, Elias, yes." The two men with Prescott shifted uncomfortably, their expressions softened by the raw, undeniable honesty of the scene. They looked from the kneeling, scarred man to the defiant, blind woman, and they saw not a monster and a victim, but two whole people finding solace in each other. Prescott stood frozen, his face a mask of thwarted rage. He had been defeated not by force, but by a love so profound it was immune to his judgment. Without another word he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, his companions following slowly behind, leaving the couple alone on the mountainside. Elias rose to his feet, his heart feeling lighter than it had in his entire adult life. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her trust absolute. He was no longer Elias Vance, the hermit, and she was no longer Clara Hale, the blind girl. They were simply Elias and Clara. The years that followed were quiet, but they were not silent. The cabin on the mountain became a true home, filled not with emptiness, but with a deep and abiding peace. Elias kept his promise. He became her eyes, painting the world for her in words. He described the way a hawk circled on an updraft, the deep purple of the lupine that bloomed in the meadow each spring, the intricate patterns of frost on the window pane on a cold winter morning. His gruff voice, once rough from disuse, became eloquent in its descriptions of the beauty he had once ignored. And she, in turn, became his beauty. She filled their home with song, her clear voice a counterpoint to the moaning of the wind. She taught him to laugh again, a deep, rumbling sound he had thought long dead. She saw him not with her eyes, but with her heart, and her unwavering acceptance was a mirror that showed him not a monster, but the hero he had always been inside. She would trace the lines of his scarred face with her fingertips, not with pity, but with a tender curiosity, learning the story of his survival, the map of his courage. They were two incomplete souls who, together, had become whole. The world below in redemption could whisper and wonder, but on their mountain they had built a different kind of world, one founded not on what was seen, but on what was felt. He was her protector, and she was his peace. He was her sight, and she was his salvation. And in the quiet evenings, as he described the stars coming out one by one in the vast, dark sky, they both knew they had found everything they would ever need.